Hey, what's up, y'all? It's KokujinKreates, aka Yin Designs, aka Ayinde Hall, here with a art demo for ink and panels. We're just doing some forest and cityscapes, so we'll do kind of like a half and half. This won't be like a full-fledged demonstration as far as start to finish. Going from sketch to ink to color, if you do add color. This will be more so just kind of a basic demonstration to show you kind of my process into how I tackle doing forest and cityscapes. So we're going to actually start off with a forest illustration. Um, really easy, really basic. The biggest thing I feel like that people don't understand about backgrounds in general is that for you as an artist, you need to kind of create the illusion of detail, not necessarily replicate detail down to the tiniest, um, portion of whatever it is you're trying to wherever you're trying to draw. So I've pulled up a few reference photos, and I'm always going to recommend that artists who are, even if you are an advanced artist, I'm going to recommend that you find reference photos of things that you want to draw, because the hardest thing ever is trying to pick up backgrounds, out of your head without knowing what they look like in real life. And I guarantee you that your favorite artists and your favorite artists, they all use reference photos, even if they're not just pulling them and putting them in the background with like a filter over them. You know what I'm saying? I'm sure they're drawing them from scratch, but at the very least, they are using some sort of reference, whether it's a picture that they've taken or a photo that they found online to reference. So I've picked up this picture right here, and this is just just a normal forest image. It's a stock photo, and that's another reason why you shouldn't just pull a picture from the internet and put a filter over it and say, okay, I'm done, for the background, because a lot of times those photos are owned by someone, right? There's a license to use that photo, and you may not have bought that or have even been knowledgeable about the fact that you needed to buy a license to use their photo, right? But just like a piece of artwork, a photo has the same legal protections. So if you use somebody's photo without paying for a license and they find out about it, you could be in trouble. Okay, so it's best to just use them as a reference, right? If you don't know how to draw something, sure, that's great, but don't just take the photo and put it in the background, put a filter over it, and be like, okay, now I've got my background. Not only does that really not help you as an artist, but you could just get into trouble, and that's something you want to alleviate when you're trying to draw. So let's get into it. So I've got this already pulled up on my other monitor. You guys can't see that, but we're going to go back to the illustration page, and I'm going to just kind of grab my pencil here. Okay. Actually, you know what? We'll use a pen, because that'll make, even though we're working digitally, I want to get the illusion of, you don't want to erase too much, right? You just get the ideas down. So let's start off with what this scene looks like, right? We've got a little bit of foreground imagery, right? Kind of like a little hill aspect action going on here. Got some rocks. And really, I think at the beginning, you kind of just want the outline of things, right? You don't want to get too detailed to start. You just want to know, like, hey, this is what I plan to draw, and this is where I'm putting it. Don't get sucked into the details, especially not now. This is just not the time for that. So, and you can also choose, and we'll get to this later on, but you can also choose to do, you know, more than what your reference image is portraying, right? Like, clearly we've got a bunch of rocks here. You could choose to remove a rock. You could choose to, you know, not even have the rocks in there at all if you don't want them there. But for today, I think we're just going to kind of, for the most part, we're going to stick with what we see, right? What we've got to work with. Give me a sec, my pen is, there we go. There we go. I haven't used this tablet in a while, so sometimes it's a little finicky when you first plugged it in. So, alright, so got the gist of the scene here. Okay, finish off that foreground section. You know, we know there's some rocks down there, and then it kind of just tapers off. There's a little bit more going on in the background, but I don't really care about that right now. Okay, cool. So, oh, and there's one more little rock over here we forgot about. Awesome. All right, so cool. So this is your foreground. All right, and like we said, we're working with a forest, and there's many different ways to portray detail for a forest background. What I like to do is, you know, you can use tools. I think I've kind of been doing a bit of a mix. So as you can see, maybe in the top left, let's go back to that illustration real quick, or that photo. As you can see up here, right, we've got, I guess, some of the branches from another tree kind of in the foreground here. So what we can do is we can use this tool, which I've already kind of pulled up. It's literally called Leaves, and it's good for, you know, bushes, foliage in general, trees. Even though you can see here we have a trees tool, right? Well, not sure what's wrong with that tool. Something's wrong with that one. But let's go back to the leaves, right? So we've got leaves, and you can see we've got grass here. So let me show you what these are going to look like, right? So whatever you've got as far as the fill, whatever color you're using, that's what's going to show up when you use this tool. And basically it works like any other brush. So you can put it across the screen like this, right? And that looks a little small. Okay, if we're looking at something that's in the foreground, maybe we want to up the particle size. The particle size is going to be the size of the actual leaves themselves. So as you can see, you know, we've got pen pressure as well as on, but if we turn that off, then it's going to be the size that we set it to, right? Default. It's going to stay that size as we're dragging the brush across the screen, right? So what we want to do here is, I'm going to keep the particle size at maybe like 150, right? And I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. But we're just going to kind of lightly drag it across the screen here. The harder you press, the darker the color will come out, right? So if you want it to be a mix, don't press as hard in some areas. Lighten it up. And that also kind of gives the illusion that, hey, you know, there's some light. You can also go back over your dark areas, right? And this is just to get the you know, the general idea that, hey, there's some leaves up there, right? So what you can do after that is actually take your brush or whatever you're using, your normal pen, and go through and maybe create some branches, right? go on top, kind of fill in the blanks, so to speak, right? If there's a little bit kind of looks like it's hanging off, you know, maybe you can draw a few individual leaves. If you feel like you want to do that, be my guest. Because what we want is the illusion that there is detail in the tree, right? The illusion that there's branches, there's, you know, things coming off of the tree in different areas. We don't need to get all the way like zooming in to the point where you're trying to get every little detail on the branches and whatnot. It's unnecessary, right? And it's going to take a lot of time to get there too. Okay, so we've added a few branches here and there, right? It could be a little bit better, but this is just a demonstration. Okay, let's go in and add this the stump of the tree, not the stump, the trunk of the tree. So clearly we've got, you know, it's a little wonky looking tree trunk. It's a smaller tree, maybe a younger tree. And really, let's just get the shape, right? We can add a few branches in there, you know, boom. Again, you know, add your leaves where you want, or you can use the tool later on top of it. I feel like a mix kind of helps it be not so much just you using that one tool, a little bit more variety to how things look. All right, okay. There's a bunch of little branches on this tree. We're not going to draw all of them. That would take forever, right? But maybe we just want a few of them. Okay, now, like I said, there's multiple ways to do this, but I know that for me, I like to kind of give the illusion that there's bark on the tree. And what I do is maybe I'll kind of like draw lines in the trunk like this, you know, here and there, overlap some lines to create the texture. And as you can see, we're gradually creating the illusion that there is texture to these branches. There's bark on the tree. You know, you can get as detailed or as non-detailed as you want to get your point across, right? If you zoom in, all you're going to see is a bunch of little scratchy lines, but from far away, because no one's going to really zoom in that close, now we look like we've got a trunk of a tree, right? And it looks like it's got detail. Like I said, you can go back in, you can add more or less detail as you see fit, but to me that looks like a tree, right? If I just at first glance, I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely a tree, right? Now let's get on to maybe the ground area, right? So I again do a little bit of a mix with my foliage. So if I've got grass on the ground, you know, I may draw a few blades by hand, you know, just to kind of give it that feel like, because when you use the tool, let me show you. When you use the tool, it's very much like, okay, there's the grass, right? There's the grass. It's going to be the same. It's kind of spread out. It's patchy, you know. This gives the illusion that there's some grass, like texture-wise on the ground. You know, you can change the particle size. You can overlap to create shadows. You can, you know, not press as hard to get the little pieces, the little blades. Okay. And I find that this is good to use, you know, sporadically, right? You don't want to use it everywhere. You can go denser in some areas to show like, hey, yeah, there's some grass there, right? Press a little harder to get your big blades. Make the particle size bigger, right? Particle size is kind of small. What if we want to make it bigger, right? You get more definition to the blades, more variety. right? Okay, so we got a little bit of grass in there. Cool. And again, like I said, you can go in and draw a few blades if you want something specific, a specific look. If you need something, I always recommend to hand draw a few areas instead of just using the tool. Because if you just use the tool all the way through, it's going to look a little bit too uniform. And your background shouldn't look uniform, right? You're drawing something that's supposed to be natural. And there's not really a lot of uniformity to nature, there can be, but a forest is, a mix of rocks and all these different plants and leaves and dirt. So you don't want it to look like, it's man-made, so to speak, right? So let's get to this rock. Okay, so I'm going to draw, and again, let's look at the picture, just so you guys can see where I'm working with, right? We're looking at this rock right here, the main one that's kind of on top of that hill. Okay, it's technically two rocks. You can see there's a little bit of grass coming off of the rock right here, so that's great that we were already using the grass tool, right? So I'm going to create that other rock. And this is going to be a tip for, backgrounds in general. Again, anything that's closer in the foreground does need to be a little bit bigger, right? Your line weight needs to match the where things are placed. How close they are to the camera or the viewer or, the point of view. And I think that, sometimes the tools, because they look a little uniform, like if you're trying to draw a specific plant or something, you might as well draw that plant by hand, right? You don't have to do it for the whole section, but like I said, do a mix. So let's get back to that rock. It's very easy to get distracted, right, when you're drawing backgrounds. All right, we're going to do a little bit of hatching here, create that shadow. Okay, and this is my process for creating, shadows. You can hatch. You can use the hatching tool. I do find it's a little bit better to use do these things by hand rather than using a tool. But some people may feel, if whatever works for you, whatever you're more comfortable with, you can definitely do that. But I just find that I don't like to use the tool as much. It doesn't look as authentic, I should say. Again, it starts to look a little too uniform. So creating the illusion of texture, right? I think we should get the cracks in the rock, right? Because there's lots of little cracks. As many as you want to show, right? And maybe some of the more defined ones that make the rock look a little more worn and weathered. Okay. Again, if you want to use the tool, so here's the difference, right? We got the tool, putting some grass on there. Looks great to me, right? You can also, here's a cool thing, right? Look at that. I'm taking away using the transparency, right? Then you can go back in with your pen and kind of fill in those spaces as you see. Let's use the correct color here. And fill in those spaces as you see fit, right? And so using a lot of those like little lines, the hatching techniques, you can just kind of like throw some lines here and there to make it look worn and weathered. You can darken areas, you can lighten areas, Like I said, whatever's working for you from that standpoint, okay? So there's our rock on the hill, okay? And we're not going to take too much longer with this because we still got to look at the cities, right? let's go to the background, right? We got more trees in the background, okay? And your trees, you know, let's go to that reference picture real quick. There's a lot of them in the background, right? You may not want that many in the background. Okay, you can get to the point where you're like, okay, I know there's a million trees in this forest, but we just need the reader to see, you know, get the illusion that this forest is dense, right? So maybe we draw a few in the background, right? We don't get too detailed. This is where you can actually completely black out these areas, because, you know, if you're looking at your background and trying to create kind of a emphasis on the foreground, maybe you darken a lot of the elements in the background. So these could actually, you know, if you want, you could go complete straight black for these tree trunks, right? Because we know they're way back there. They're way back there. Nobody's really giving them the time of day, right? They're just pieces in the background. Got one tree that may be a little bit closer, so maybe we give that one a little bit more definition. We still keep it a little darker than things in the foreground, right? I feel like here's another tip, right? This is just for backgrounds in general, once again. If you give no spacing in between your pieces that are in the foreground and the things that are in the background, everything starts to kind of mesh together. So I'm going to show you what that means, right? Like here's your ground in the foreground, right? Okay, that kind of edge on the or the outline of your foreground should definitely be thicker and darker than what's going on in the background, right? Your lines should gradually get thinner the further away things are in the background. And that's actually something that I had picked up pretty recently. You know, I realized that my line thickness was a little bit too uniform all the way through. Like my background was just as thick as my foreground, and so everything started to look flat. You create the illusion of depth the smaller your lines get. The thinner your lines get in the background, right? So let's go back to that leaf tool real quick. We can turn the particle size down, maybe about here, right? And so now, oh, that might be a little bit too big still. Let's go a little even smaller than that. Let's go maybe like 90. Undo those. So that looks pretty good, right? And granted, this isn't exactly, you know, what the forest looks like back there, but maybe this is kind of like the section that has the most trees and whatnot. We still got our foreground foliage, and here's where, you know, if you're working digitally, you absolutely want to put a layer. You know, if you're working foreground and background, we didn't do that because this is a demo, and we're just trying to get things done as quickly as possible. But definitely utilize the layers. You do not want your foreground and your background on the same layer. So really, we should have been working with these leaves on a completely different layer below our foreground layer. So that way, when we do, you know, stuff like this, for example, right? It's below the leaves. The leaves are always in the front, are always going to show up on top, right? And then if we go back through and erase areas, we're only erasing what was behind what we just worked on, right? And you can also turn the opacity down so you can see a little bit better, like, okay, where do I actually need to erase, you know? On top, that's overlapping the foreground and the background. Okay, so we're not going to get too deep into that, but there we go. Okay, now lastly, and then we're going to move on to Cityscapes. This is kind of like this is the dirt, right? Dirt is interesting because as long as it looks like, you know, you've got your lines in the ground or whatever, people are going to know that that's something, right? It's not a tile floor in a kitchen, right? Or glass or whatever, right? For me, I like to just throw a few lines here and there. You know, you can crosshatch, you can draw, you know, maybe a few branches on the ground. You can kind of create the illusion that there's unevenness to the ground, right? Because it is natural, right? So we've got our, you know, our grass here. We could create like a little ledge there, and it's already kind of starting to come together, as you can see. The illusion of texture. All right, maybe we pull the grass tool out again. Oh, not the grass, that's the leaf tool. Let's try that again. Pull the grass tool out again. All right, it's a little bit bigger. Let's go turn that particle size down again, since we're working in the background. Okay. There we go. Okay. And again, you can go back through and erase anything that's kind of just hanging that doesn't make any sense, because you are using a brush tool and that is going to happen. So. Okay. So you can see I'm using the same brush size. I'm only darkening my lines in the foreground to separate my foreground and my background. But for you, I would recommend, you know, probably completely changing the brush size altogether, right? We're on 17 right now. If you want to start working in the background, maybe you go to 8, right? 8 is super duper thin, as you can see, right? So if you get even further in the background, make it even smaller, right? Cool, cool, cool. Okay, so we're not going to get through this whole section, but this whole picture, I'm not going to draw an entire forest scene from scratch, you know. For this entire demo, we are going to work on cityscapes as well. I know a lot of you guys want to see that. So, but this is just kind of an intro to give you an idea of what it's like to work on a forest scene in the background. Okay. If you want to get more illusions of texture, right? Like you see, there's lots of algae, moss on these rocks. You know, maybe you give the illusion by, and you can also, you know, you can always practice this, you know, separately in a corner. Like, okay, how do I want my moss to look? What do I want to do to create the illusion that there's moss on this rock, you know, compared to the other sections of the rock? And so you would go work on that, and you come back, and you're like, okay, that kind of looks good to me, right? Okay, so specifically maybe like, okay, this rock in particular, and this will be the last section we do before we go to cityscapes. This rock in particular that's kind of in the front has a ton of moss and algae on it, right? So we're going to move through that, right, by maybe just creating little tick marks, right? And you could go in and use different tools if you wanted to. I mean, we've got these like grasslands, grass patch tools, you know, fallen leaves. You can use these for the ground. You know, we have a ground tool. So what that looks like, right? Gives the illusion of kind of like dust, dirt. Okay? All of that. All of these, you know, use everything that you have. Everything at your disposal. Don't feel like you only got to use a couple of tools, you know, to make it work. Right? Because this looks great. You know, and just going over those sections, you could even use, and don't even be deceived by what a tool is called, right? Like if it just says leaves, you know, or ground, for example, like you can create texture with the tools by, you know, just using them how you want to use them. You know, if you go over a few sections and you feel like, oh, that looks pretty good as texture for something else, do that, right? Don't feel locked in to just using the tool the way that it's named, right? Oh, it's ground tool, I have to use that for the ground, right? And we'll get it, you know, if you want to get a more in-depth tutorial, you can get more into like altering the tools themselves. You know, you can change the angle of the tool if you're working in different directions. You know, there's a lot of things that you can do, right? So, what do you guys think? That looks pretty good, right? Compared to what we